Hello, welcome to the Hidden Center, where we wrestle with monsters, lions, and men. I'm your host, Dennis Damone, a lover of wisdom, words, and wonders, and today, I want to talk to you about Socrates. Now, Socrates has been getting more and more popular recently, it seems, on the online YouTube world. You had Jordan Peterson giving a talk that went viral, as he often does, talking about the death of Socrates and how he prepared himself for the life to come. And it was a moving talk. It went pretty viral. And so it got a lot of attention. Like, who is this Socrates fellow? And why does his death matter? Meanwhile, you have Jordan Peterson's close collaborator, John Vervaeke, making a whole nearly 20-part series discussing the philosophy, life, and practices of Socrates. So this is becoming more and more relevant in our day, but you may be just sitting there wondering, why should I care? Who was this Socrates person, and why does it matter to me? Well, to answer that question, I think we need to look at four things. We need to look at the culture that Socrates came out of. We need to look at Socrates himself, his life, his death, and what it meant to the people who knew him. Then we need to look specifically at Socrates in the way that he lived, because he was a philosopher, and he thought that meant something very different than what we tend to think of as a philosopher. A philosopher, in his mind, is both someone who has access to certain important truths and a person who lives in a particular way. So we're going to have to look at the claims about truth that Socrates made, and we're going to have to look at the practices, the way that he lived. So, 4-part series: his context, his life, his philosophical claims, his philosophical practices. We'll look at all four. In this first video, let's talk about his context, his culture. Now, why do we need to know anything about the Golden Age of Athens in which Socrates lived? Well, the answer is the Golden Age of Athens was very similar in some striking ways to our own age here in America and in the West more broadly. And because of how similar our two cultures are, we can see that someone like Socrates, who found a way to navigate the strangeness and difficulty, the beauty and trials of his own time, might give us some insight on how to navigate ours. So there are 4 areas that I see a deep similarity between Socrates' time and ours. His was a time of great cultural production, great works of art were being produced. His was a time of great political tensions. Athens was in a kind of cold war and then an active war with Sparta throughout Socrates' lifetime. Secondly, it was a time of great uncertainty. There were a lot of voices in their culture, in the Athenian culture, claiming to know exactly how to live and how to be, but they all disagreed with each other. Does this sound familiar? To me, it sounds a lot like our time. But perhaps the way that his time was most like ours was that he lived, number 4, in the midst of a meaning crisis. So let's look at all 4 of those things. Socrates lived at a time of great cultural production. He was contemporaries with the great Athenian comedian, Aristophanes. If you want a great laugh, if you just want to be laughing until you can't breathe, even though it's not politically correct, look up the Lysistrata. This play has been reinterpreted a number of times into different contexts, but it will just make you laugh so hard. Stuff is still funny. At the same time as Aristophanes, the comedian, you have Sophocles, the tragedian. If you've heard the name Oedipus, it's because of Sophocles. These great, moving, gripping, sorrowful stories have haunted our culture and our imagination for thousands of years, and they were written while Socrates was still alive. You also have the early historians, Herodotus and Thucydides. You have great orators like Pericles giving his amazing funeral oration, which probably was one of the inspirations for Abraham Lincoln's own Gettysburg Address. And then, of course, you have Euripides. Euripides was kind of the Quentin Tarrantino of his day. He wrote these gory, horrifying stories, some of which would just seem to have gore for the sake of gore, tales of mothers killing their own children to get back at their husbands. Gruesome stuff. Makes me think of Godfather Part 2. Horrible story, that. But he also tugged at the conscience of Athens. Athens had inherited this great martial epic, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, that glorified the Athenian heroes who went off to war in Troy. But Euripides asks the very salient question, what about the women of Troy? What happened to them? Well, what happened to them is what happened to every woman at a conquered city. They were raped, killed, cast aside as useless. Euripides asks, are we really building our culture off the glorification of horrors like that? Sounds like a very relevant question, as we in America have to wrestle with very uncomfortable truths about the stories that we've inherited and the people that founded us. I don't want to ally myself with critical race theory. I have my own questions and concerns about that body of thought. But it's hard to hear about the way that Thomas Jefferson treated the children that he had with slave women, slaves in his own house, how some of his children became slaves in his own house who served him food. Anyone who isn't made uncomfortable by that isn't really paying attention. Now, conservatives will be up in arms immediately, telling me that how I should not dare to question the cultural norms, the wonderful heroes of our past. How dare I? Well, that's neither here nor there, but what I want to point out is that the same thing was happening in Socrates' day. Aristophanes, the comedian, was a cultural conservative. He didn't like this Euripides fellow who was calling into question all the cultural norms and heroes of their past, and he lambasted him in his play The Frogs. So the whole tension between cultural conservatives and progressives who want to question the moral superiority of the heroes of our past, this isn't a new phenomenon, it's ancient. And it's something that Socrates had to find a way to navigate, just as you and I have to find a way to navigate it. Simultaneously, with all this great cultural production, and again, I want to emphasize, our age is like that. We have the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is hopefully coming to a close after Endgame, which was just such a tremendous cultural event. And you have smaller authors or auteurs like Wes Anderson producing these amazing small little works of art and beauty, or Quentin Tarrantino producing horrific but enjoyable films. You have great artists, John Bellion, Noah Kahan, Taylor Swift with her amazing tour that just completed. Our age is very similar to Socrates, and we have the same questions, but it was also, like our own time, an age of political tension. The generation before Socrates was successful in a great war against Persia. You've probably seen the movie, or at least seen clips from the movie, The 300. That was the generation before Socrates. They successfully defended the great Greek city-states from invasions from the far greater power of Persia, not unlike how America defended itself against the invasions of the Japanese and of the Nazis. But again, in a shocking similarity, in order to become powerful enough to defeat the Persians, the Greek city-states became so powerful that they began to exert not very wholesome influence on the states that surrounded them, on the city-states that surrounded them. Two great powers emerged, Athens and Sparta, and every city-state in Greece had to pay homage to one of those two. Not unlike how the world divided itself between Russia and America for several years after the fall of the Nazis and is now beginning to divide itself between America and China. What with China's efforts to build a new international Silk Road and to develop a currency that's independent of American hegemony. These are dangerous times. It's difficult to know how to order yourself towards life when there's so much tension abroad. Is America the good guys? Are the Chinese or the Russians the good guys? Many people have different opinions. And they did in Socrates' days too. The battle was waged between those who nominally worshipped the goddess of wisdom and those who worshipped the god of war, the Spartans and the Athenians. One would hope that those who cared about wisdom, those who wanted to resist tyranny, and hear me truly, the Spartans were a pretty tyrannical state. They were not to be admired. There were two classes of people in Sparta. There were the warriors, and there were the slaves. If you were a slave, your life was miserable. But if you were a warrior, your life was miserable too. You didn't have the great works of art that were coming out of Athens. You just had battle. You just had misery. It's not unlike North Korea, best I can tell. Some classic scholar out there is probably going to get mad at me for that comparison, but I'm just trying to point out some similarities, some relevance. The world that Socrates lived in politically was very like our own, both in the time of kinds of tension with foreign powers, but also interiorly. And this is my third point. Socrates' time was a time of great uncertainty in politics. The internal politics of Athens were riotous. Every male citizen, and there weren't that many of them, had the right to vote in the assembly. It was a democracy, inspired by some of the same ideals that inspired the American system of governments. But just like then, and just like now, when you have democracy, the people became very vulnerable to demagogues, to orators, to rhetoricians. This manifests itself in many different ways in our time. We immediately think of the political example, but honestly, advertising, corporations, I've started to think that the corporations that rule our lives, the Apples, the Googles, the people who, I don't even know their names, but the petrol, the car manufacturers, these are becoming sort of like little countries within the country of America. And they have their own orators and rhetoricians. They're called advertisers. They bombard us with messaging, trying to convince us to enter into their little kingdom of products. Do you see the loyalty that people show to these little mini kingdoms, to Apple or Samsung, to Facebook or Twitter? We almost had like an all-out medieval joust, brawl, as it were, between the head of Facebook and the head of Twitter in the past year. These are crazy times. And that's not even touching on the political uncertainty. I'm recording this just as Donald Trump was convicted by a court in New York of a crime. He's the first American president to be convicted of a crime. People have been asking me ever since it happened, what do you think? Do you think that Donald Trump deserved this? Do you think that the American judicial system was just to convict him? Do you think there were political motives? Everyone seems to have an opinion, and I'm just left here uncertain. How could I even begin to wade through the oceans of content and material that would be required to know the answer to such a question? Socrates faced these kinds of questions in his day, too. In the middle of a war with Sparta, there was a kind of a cold war constantly, but all-out war at this point. One of Socrates' young friends, Alcibiades, a powerful politician, convinced the Athenian assembly to abandon their fight with Sparta to an extent, to pull back, to attack an island that was utterly unrelated to the conflict at hand. He convinced them with powerful arguments, with essentially advertising techniques, what we would call them now, that this was to their best advantage. He just wanted the glory of leading men in battle. And so when he won the vote, when he was voted captain of this fleet of ships to go out and conquer this random island in the middle of nowhere, he had a great drunken brawl with his friends, went through the town of Athens in the middle of the night, broke all sorts of religious statues, and then left on the ships before anyone was the wiser. When they woke up and found their city kind of like a frat party wreck, they sent ships after Alcibiades telling him, you need to come back so that you could be tried for crimes. He proceeded to ignore them, go to Sparta, and offer to sell state secrets to Sparta in order to defeat the Athenians. The Spartans thought this was a great idea. They took advantage of him. They left him in Sparta and went off to take advantage of the state secrets he'd given them to attack Athens. When they came back about a year later, they found the king's wife pregnant. No Spartan is foolish enough to sleep with the king's wife, so the culprit was obvious. Yet Alcibiades weaseled his way out of it yet again, went to Persia, the ancient enemy of Greece, and tried to sell state secrets to them, saying, I've been a counselor to both the Athenians and the Spartans. I can tell you how to defeat both of them together. That's about where we lose track of Alcibiades. I believe somebody finally executed the guy. He got his comeuppance. But can you imagine what it was like being an Athenian citizen while all this was happening? Many of the people, you had to have a majority vote to get Alcibiades elected to go off and fight that battle. And then the very next day, the very people who voted him into that seat voted him out of it. I don't really know if we can make a direct comparison between what was happening in Athens and what's happening now with Trump. I see things that are admirable in Trump, and I see things that are despicable. I see things that were admirable in Alcibiades and things that were despicable. How do we navigate that? These are the kinds of questions that Socrates was forced to ask during his day, during his time. And all of this coalesced into a meaning crisis. Now, meaning crisis is a term that John Vervaeke has popularized, and all credit goes to John Vervaeke for pointing out that what we're living through is a crisis of meaning, in that it's very hard to find meaning, to find something worth living for or something worth dying for. We don't know what it all means, what all that is going on around us means. We don't have a path forward. All the things that we've explored already, the similarities between Socrates' time and ours, shows the unity of different aspects of the meaning crisis. But I want to focus on one more, which is the apparent conflict between nature and culture, or rather between the students of nature and culture. Now, classically, nature and culture are two of the primary sources of meaning in our lives. How many people have been moved to tears by watching a sunset or attending a Shakespeare play? How many people have found something worth living for through exploring the great beauty of nature or coming to understand in ever greater detail the findings of the great sciences, and simultaneously found great meaning through study of poetry or plays or religion, which hopefully should unify both nature and culture? But in Socrates' day, it was beginning to feel as though nature and culture were at war. The earliest of scientists were writing in the generation before Socrates, and they began to say things like, the sun is a great big hot rock. Now, in Athens, you didn't swear on the Bible when you were going to the law courts. You swore on the sun. You swore on the chariot of Apollo. But if the chariot of Apollo is not a chariot and he's not going to strike you down if you tell a lie, then, well, that cultural institution of honesty has just been undermined by the finding of scientists. Meanwhile, the avatars of culture aren't doing any better. The orators and rhetoricians, the sophists of Socrates' day, had discovered that by saying the right catchphrases, referencing Homer or one of the great plays at just the right moment, they could capture the attention of the politicians and win elections, much as now every politician finds some opportunity to quote the scriptures or to make reference to some great cultural artifact. And so culture has been subsumed to power, and this discredits it with the scientists. It seems there could be no truth to be found in these great aspects of culture. And meanwhile, the people who love culture are dismayed by the scientists and ridicule them. The great Aristophanes, as I mentioned earlier, he wrote a play ridiculing the scientists and the philosophers who were studying nature, ridiculing the atheists, because back then as now, those who study nature have a tendency towards thinking that perhaps God doesn't exist. You should be able to see what a great trial this is for a culture to have its two sources of meaning in conflict with each other and constantly undermining each other. And it shouldn't be that strange to you because we're living through it too. The scientists of our day, at least the popular one, tend towards atheism. They tend towards a sort of undermining disposition that undermines the cultural artifacts that we all grew up with. Meanwhile, the avatars of our culture have become politicized. The Bible becomes a tool for winning votes and elections, not a source of wisdom and truth. This causes great chaos because human beings are truth and meaning-seeking animals. We don't want to hold on to cultural forms that aren't true. And we don't want the truth to take away our sense of meaning and purpose. So this is the place where we see the greatest similarity between Socrates' days and our own. And we begin to see why Socrates is becoming more and more relevant. Because what Socrates did for those who came under his sway in Athens was give them a way of navigating all the strange things that were happening in Athens in that time. And perhaps he can do the same thing for our time too. If you find this interesting, check out the next 3 videos where we discuss, or at least begin to discuss, Socrates himself, his life. And then we will look at Socrates, the philosopher, the truths that he taught, and the way of life that he practiced. And as always, thank you for your time and attention.